recording of our presentations and turn it over to Marian.
Thank you, Kane. I have a few slides, which I will share with you in 1 second. So thank you all for joining us. And my job here is to just introduce you to what some of the problems are and what some of the solutions are. But I think what's really important to remember is that the election ecosystem contains several different but related systems that, because they are computers or networked or both, can be vulnerable to hacking. And I want to say at the outset, as I always do, that these are risks, not certainties, and their election equipment requires special handling, but you can never get the risk down to zero, which is why there needs to be some kind of a recovery plan, which Larry's going to talk about later. But first, just as an initial matter, the 2016 election underscored that what were the targets, and that it changed the threat model as far as who could possibly interfere with our elections. So I want to first, what we need to understand is that we have voter registration databases. We have that also are used for printing poll books, and they're also used to populate electronic poll books. That's different, but somewhat related to the voting machines and voting equipment that voters use, and then there's the election night return reporting systems. And in addition to those, there are internet-facing applications that many states use. Some are for finding your polling place. Some are for checking your voter registration. There's online voter registration applications. So all of these present risks and vulnerabilities that need to be identified and managed. So this is just a kind of an example of a voter registration database. This is similar to many states. Not all states are like this, but the voter registration database is central, may be maintained at the Department of State or the Secretary of State or the Board of Elections, and it's connected over some kind of a network to other computers at the county or even state workstations. And because of those network connections, it could be breached. So as we saw in 2016, the registration database was breached, and the Arizona voter registration database was also breached. They were different actors, but this is what a hack could look like in 2018. Some bad actor might be able to get into the voter rolls and do something, for example, change registration information. And what that might mean is that voters might show up at the polls. They might be told they're at the wrong polling place. They may be directed to another polling place. This could cause long lines and confusion and a little bit of chaos. For example, throughout, in every election, there are reports of things like this happening. It's very difficult to tell whether that's the result of a hack or an error or something else. But I think that the takeaway here is that need to understand the root cause of these issues and investigate them so that they can be rectified later. So the most common cyber attacks are phishing attacks, where somebody attempts to get control of someone's username and password, or a distributed denial of service attack, where they just bombard a website with a heavy load, and this is kind of a representation of that, so that it locks up and freezes. There's been no reports or anything like that, but for example, if a database were to go down right before, for example, if the online voter registration application were to crash or not allow people to use it immediately before the election, that could be a cause. It's one of several causes. I put this SQL injection slide up there because I believe that is how bad actors got access to the Illinois voter registration database. The second part of the ecosystem that we talked about before is the voting systems themselves. These are computers. They count both votes. There are two kinds of voting systems in use in the United States. One, that an optical scan computer that counts paper ballots, and the other records the votes directly onto computer memory. So I just, this slide just shows the extent of the problem. There's 36 states have still using direct recording electronic voting equipment that has a set of risks and vulnerabilities because the voters' choices are directly recorded onto the computer. Now, some of them may have a record, a paper record, but many do not. 5 states have 100% of the voters are using these systems. And the takeaway here is, yes, it's a risk. It's not a certainty. Can't get the risk down to 0, but if something happens, it will be very hard to detect, and it will be impossible to recover from it. So this is just I'm just going to run through very quickly. It's just because the voting devices themselves are not connected to the internet, it's possible to attack it through the computer that runs the centralized management software. So if there was a program that injected malware into this computer before each election, then they could spread the malware to all the machines across 1 or more counties, depending on how those are programmed. And I want to show this slide that the WGBF in Augusta, Georgia had after the Georgia litigation. One of the witnesses testified that the computer that they used to program the voting machines had been connected to the internet or to a network, and that laptop was brought in, the files were loaded onto a USB drive, and then inserted into the Georgia election management system. That's a huge risk of attack. This is just an example. I picked on Colorado. Every state has an election night results reporting website. And what this might look like is, suppose, these are unofficial results when they're reported on election night, but if a bad actor tried to alter the result or did a denial of service attack that brought the site down, that would undermine confidence in the election results. So the states, and Larry's going to talk about this, need to have a plan in order to anticipate what that might look like and how to recover from it quickly on election night. So cybersecurity experts agree that we've moved away from prevention and go to monitor, detect, respond, and recover. And so how are we going to do that now? Well, first of all, for voter registration databases, we're asking voters to check their reg. You can do it online in many states. And if you find a problem, we're asking to call the hotline, but also call the county and find out if there's a problem. But it's very important that you report it, because then those problems could be detected beforehand and might be able to avoid problems on election day, like a lot of provisional ballots. This slide just shows, for voting machines, we advocate under current technology, you need to have a voter marked paper ballot, whether marked by hand or device, and then that's retained as a backup for recounts and audits. And then we recommend statistical audits, risk limiting audits, because you have to check and make sure that the software operated properly. And this is a flow chart that shows what is the process. What does that mean? When people say audits, you may not, what it means is this is the process of how you statistically sample ballots to make sure the software reported correctly. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Larry, because he's going to discuss the kinds of disaster recovery plans that states can put into place to protect those other pieces of the IT infrastructure from attacks. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Marianne. So I actually don't have slides, so you just have to look at me during my brief presentation. One thing that I wanted to mention before getting into the recovery side of things and what can be done ahead of election day, in fact, people are already voting, to deal with any kind of error or potentially malicious act against our election infrastructure, is to just remind people, and to the extent that they don't know, bring people up to speed a little bit on the fact that there have been things that have happened over the past year in particular that should help us to prevent or detect attacks against our election infrastructure. Most importantly, there's a lot more awareness of this problem now among election officials. There have been extensive cybersecurity trainings provided by the Department of Homeland Security, the Election Assistance Commission, the Belfer Center at Harvard, and others of election officials for how to be on the lookout for potential attacks. The Department of Homeland Security has offered, as part of its critical infrastructure program, risk and vulnerability assessments. Others have that outside of DHS have offered this to some states as well. We know that 28 states, as of May 2018, said, according to an AP survey, that they wanted these assessments. These assessments are an opportunity to find where there are vulnerabilities in the system, all that entire system that Marianne showed us earlier, and hopefully to patch any kind of weaknesses that are found. I'm just going through some of the main things, structures that have been put in place. I could talk for a while about this. There is now much better information sharing, which was a big problem prior to the 2016 election. Among election officials, the Election Assistance Commission and Department of Homeland Security have set up a government coordinating council where the federal government and the states and locals can share information about what's happening. And we have seen some states beef up their cybersecurity staff. Congress provided a one-time payment last March of about $380 million to the states. Not nearly enough, I think, and I can talk about this in a little while for what the needs are, but this did allow, among other things, some states like Nevada to beef up the cybersecurity staff that they have. Of course, we're already into early voting for this election, for the general election. The election day itself is, I believe, in 22 days. So any big changes to our election infrastructure along the lines of what Marianne was talking about towards the end of her presentation, with changing equipment and things like that, is probably no longer possible ahead of this election. But there are a lot of things that can be done to recover if there are problems. Marianne, of course, mentioned people encouraging voters to check their voter registration, which pretty much everywhere they can do online to see that their information is correct. That's really critical. People should confirm, even if they're certain that they're registered, that all their information is accurate. To the extent that it's not, and they inform election officials, that can form a kind of early warning sign to election officials that something's not right with their registration databases and the information that they have on it. They're going to want to know that ahead of time if they can, and fix it ahead of time if they can. Even if they can't, even if on election day you have one of the scenarios that Marianne mentioned, and I should say this has happened by accident somewhere in pretty much every federal election that I can remember, where there's just wrong information on the registration database or on electronic poll books, or the electronic poll books aren't starting. We need to have to take advantage of a requirement in federal law for provisional ballots. These are ballots that voters can fill out with their information on it and cast, and it will be counted after the election if election officials go back and look and see and discover that there was some kind of problem with their database or with their e-poll books. So the Brennan Center is encouraging every polling place to have about 2 to 3 hours worth of provisional ballots in place in case there's some kind of problem. We've seen what happens if you don't have that kind of protection in place. In Durham, North Carolina in 2016, and Arizona in the primaries this year, they had problems with e-poll books. If you don't have enough provisional ballots, what ends up happening is while election officials are trying to figure out what's wrong, if they're trying to get systems up and running, you can get really long lines and people can be discouraged from voting. One thing that we want to encourage all voters is if you get to the polling place, no matter what you're being told, ask them to make sure that they're not making a mistake in terms of your registration. And if they still say they can't find you, don't leave until you've voted that provisional ballot. As Marion mentioned, there are a lot of states that are still using DREs or electronic voting systems. They're not using paper ballots. And we are encouraging those states to make sure that they have sufficient numbers of emergency paper ballots in case their electronic voting machines stop working. Again, this happens in virtually every election, in every federal election, that there are some problems somewhere with their voting machines. We saw it in the primaries again this year in South Carolina, in Richland County. They were lucky. They had an election official who made sure that he had sufficient emergency paper ballots, so people were able to continue voting while they figured out what was wrong with those machines and brought in extras and got them up and running. But we don't want a situation because whether by error or some malicious acts, the machines aren't working. And there are all kinds of ways that that could happen. It could be that the machines just aren't running. It could be that names are missing from the ballots. We want people to be able to continue to vote if something like that is discovered. 34 states are now using electronic poll books. We want to make sure that there's a backup of those poll books of some sort so that if they're not working, they're still able to process voters and voters are able to vote. It's all about really resiliency and recovery and making sure that anything goes wrong, we're still going to make sure that people get through and cast their ballots, and we can figure out later what happened to make sure that we can count them. Longer term, I would reiterate some of the things that Marion said. We need to replace voting equipment. The Brennan Center did a survey in March. 33 election officials in 33 states told us that they need to replace their equipment by 2020. There are many reasons for this. Often these systems are no longer manufactured. It's difficult to find replacement parts. We had election officials tell us they're going to eBay to find replacement part for these systems, which certainly is not something that I think any security expert would recommend. 5 states we're particularly concerned. There are 5 states that are still all paperless. Another 8 or 9, depending on how you count, that are using paperless systems in at least some of their polling places as their primary equipment. A number of states, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Louisiana, Arkansas, have made concrete steps to replacing their equipment before 2020, that paperless equipment. The Brennan Center recently got a letter from the General Counsel of the Board of Elections in South Carolina saying that they too are going to replace their paperless equipment before 2020. But we still have several states, including New Jersey and Indiana and others, where there isn't yet that commitment to replace their equipment. And in fact, even in the states where there is replacement, there is a commitment at the top of the state to replace equipment. We've started seeing pushback. It's cost money, and that states are legislatures in particular are often pushing back and saying, is it really so important for us to do this? And so I think that's going to continue to be a fight. More and better audits along the lines that Marion suggested is also really important. The final thing I'll say is a long-term investment in our election infrastructure and making it more secure is really critical. As I said, there's some pushback in states that we're seeing in states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey from certain officials about not wanting to spend the money to replace this equipment. On the other hand, Congress gave a one-time $380 million last March. I think there's going to need to be a longer-term investment, but we also have to have an agreement between the federal government and the states about the proper roles of each in securing federal elections and who's providing the money for that. Just last week, we saw a letter from the Executive Committee of the National Association for Secretaries of States saying that while they might take federal money, they didn't want any new requirements to come with that federal money, and that's probably not sustainable. If Congress is going to be, which I think they should, be investing further in our election infrastructure to make sure that federal elections are secure, I think they have a right, in fact, an obligation to make sure that that money is spent in a responsible way and is actually being used to make our elections more secure. So those are long-term questions for after the election that I think we as a country are going to really have to grapple with. Now I'll leave it at that, Akini, for you.
Thank you so much, Larry. I'm just going to get my screen shared here again. So I'm going to talk really briefly, and then we can get to your questions about engaging voters to secure the vote. And I think just before I dive in, I'm going to talk about what's changed and not changed since 2016. I think it's important to just acknowledge that we can't say there was no hack of a vote count or any system, nor can we say there was one if we don't have evidence. But a lack of evidence is not proof that there was no hack. And I think it's a question of risks, and it's a question of doing our very best at every level of the government. So I just want to highlight that, because I think that that's the truth of the matter, and that's what many of our activists are looking to hear and understand, is that we're doing just the best that we can, which includes moving towards proven secure systems like paper ballots, like statistical or risk limiting audits. So what has changed? I'm sorry, I lost my slide here. What has changed since 2016? For the better, there's better communication between the Department of Homeland Security and state election officials, Department of Homeland Security. That's something that state election officials have been pointing out a lot, which is fantastic in terms of threat awareness and coordination. Election officials have signed up for security alerts from the Center for Internet Security. Some know that as the EI-ISAC or the MS-ISAC. All 50 states are signed up. Only about 1,000, according to reports latest on BuzzFeed, local governments are signed up, which needs to increase tenfold. It's really important to have every responsible party overseeing our elections getting security updates and starting to get familiar, for those who have smaller IT budgets or less experience with IT, familiar with what the threats are. And some states have made more serious moves. Arkansas has moved in all but one county to voting machines that have a paper record. That is huge, and it's not as celebrated as we would like. It's going to make for a very different and hopefully more secure election this fall. Wisconsin and Washington both passed, in one case, regulations, in other case, a law to improve their audits. Pennsylvania and Delaware, and it sounds like South Carolina, have committed to having paper records by 2020. We hope that that will come to fruition. But then there's some things that are not better. There's still too many jurisdictions that are relying on paperless voting systems for in-person voting. There's many, many jurisdictions that have inadequate audits to detect, even have the possibility of detecting a hack or an error, right? There may be an excellent audit, and that's statistically significant enough to affirm an outcome of an election. It may or may not lead to the detection of a hack or error, but it might show problems in the vote count that could lead to further investigation of a hack or an error and looking for evidence of that. So this is shorthand. I want to point out for sure that that's not a foolproof way to detect. It's very difficult, as I said earlier, to detect hacks in particular. And then there's just uneven resources. Many election jurisdictions need more money, and over the last year, Secure Our Vote and other advocacy groups with grassroots members have been reaching out to local election officials, asking how we can help, from being poll workers to helping advocate for more funds for consistent and regular security upgrades. And it's absolutely critical from the state and the federal level and the county level that there's political support for election security, and that unevenness of the lack of funding for many counties to make the transitions they need is a major issue. So I just want to applaud Arkansas for moving away from paperless direct recording electronic machines. It's wonderful, and they have one county left that needs funding to go there, but they made excellent use of their federal funds and state funds to move to more secure systems. I think it's been said, but just bears repeating, what we need by 2020, in addition to more resilient voter databases and websites for reporting election results, are paper ballots for every vote cast. And this is not an endorsement of a voting machine, but rather an old machine that's not on the market anymore, as an example of a scanner. that counts paper ballots. And then on the right is a risk limiting audit done in Orange County, and just stronger audits that can, as much as possible, verify that the outcome of our elections are correct. And these can be observable by the public. They empower people to feel that their vote counted and to engage in the process. And we really applaud every jurisdiction that's piloting these this year or early next year or after the 2018 election. Is a great time to give this a try and see how it works. The Secure Our Vote Coalition, really quickly, is working to build political power to support election security initiatives. It was founded by Common Cause, Rock the Vote, Public Citizen, and the Center for American Progress. And we help voters learn through dozens of webinars, through one-on-one support, through sort of demystifying documents, how to take this issue of election security and work on it just like any other political issue. So our top priorities: a paper record for every vote cast, whether marked by hand or an assistive device, a way to check the results through an audit that can help detect correct or false outcomes, and then the kind of resiliency in voter rolls that both Larry and Marian were discussing, so that every voter can cast a ballot on election day if they choose to. So a couple of victories. In Washington state, that audit law improved because of a citizen activist named Kirsten Miller, who engaged with her League of Women Voters chapter in the state after attending a webinar for Secure Our Vote, and passed a stronger law that now makes it possible for county election officials to do risk limiting audits. It's pretty awesome. Similarly, in Wisconsin, we had really excellent leadership on the part of the Wisconsin Elections Commission and their elections director, interested in audits, visiting and looking at Colorado's risk limiting audits. But then we brought 1,500 plus people in support through comments and emails to the Election Commission to make it possible for them to make that change, despite some amount of concern or foot dragging on the part of some folks in the state. So this is my contact information. I want to make sure that we get to your questions. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself using *6 if you're on the phone. You can also unmute yourself or raise your hand using the participant queue if you're on the webinar. But *6 to mute and to unmute again. Open for questions. Don't go all at once.
I have a question. This is Karen Planty. I'm a technical election judge in Illinois. I'm also a cybersecurity practitioner. And do you have any suggestions or advice for people on the ground on election day, things we should be watching for, other than things that you've highlighted in this webinar?
Well, no, I was gonna, I mean, other than things we've mentioned in the webinar, I mean, you know, that I think one example from the 2016 election in North Carolina with the e-poll books, where e-poll books either were not functioning or had, or the data was incorrect. I mean, that could, if you're in a jurisdiction that uses those, that could cause a lot of chaos on election day. So one thing to do beforehand, especially if you are going to be in a polling place, is to get a paper backup, as Larry may have mentioned, of the poll book in case the e-poll book is not operating or is operating with wrong data. And having that ability to respond to something like that quickly is really important. The other things that happen, the most common things on election day that happen are voting machines that are just broken. They're just, for whatever reason, whether their battery ran out or they're not recording, or a lot of times with the touchscreens, although the new touchscreens won't have this problem, but the older touchscreens might have calibration issues, which requires them to be down for a period of time until a technician can come and fix it. But if you're seeing a pattern across your county, that's something you really want to report, like right away. if you're hearing about this from other people on the ground.
I just have a couple of other quick things to add to that. Almost every state, although there are a couple, Hawaii and in Indiana and Tennessee where this isn't true, there's pre-election testing done on every machine. That's an opportunity to see if there are, and this happened in Nevada, in fact, in the primary, that, silly things on the touchscreen machines, but really important, like names are missing from candidates who should be on the ballot. The pre-election, being there for the pre-election testing to see if there are problems is certainly something that's important and useful. As Marion mentioned, you do have on the older GRPs this problem of vote flipping, and those machines should be taken out of service as immediately if somebody is reporting that they're voting for one candidate and another candidate is showing up. Because when there is that kind of calibration error, it's just going to get worse over the course of a day until those machines are taken out of service and either fixed or replaced. And finally, I would say, probably the biggest problem that we have on election day is related to registration and people not being listed as registered when they say they should have been. And this could be because of the kinds of attacks that we're talking about, but frankly, and I'm particularly worried about this in states that that were covered by the Voting Rights Act that no longer are, as a result of the Shelby County decision. Sometimes voters are improperly taken off the rolls, and we've seen a doubling of purges in states that were covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so encouraging people to get provisional ballots if their names can't be found, and making a call into 866 Our Vote, which Marion mentioned earlier. That's election protection. We're all part of that coalition. We're taking calls and trying to help fix problems. And the more information we get about problems like that, the more we'll be able to see if there is some kind of a pattern of a problem that may show something bigger than just a simple glitch.
If you're, just to interject quickly, if I muted you, it's because we're having some background noise. If you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself again when there's an opening, and just trying to keep the call line clear. Next question.
Hello, this is Christian Vasquez from Politico. I'm just curious, there was a report by the NPR over the weekend about some people were trying to register who were overseas who had their IP addresses blocked. And there was also another one by the Philadelphia Inquirer, I believe. So that kind of brings a question of like trying to keep cybersecurity while also trying to make it easier for the voters. Have you heard of things like this, and can you talk a little about maybe something else besides the foreign IP issues that y'all might have heard of? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, Larry, but the wholesale blocking of foreign IP addresses is generally not considered a good practice because, number one, any attacker, even a minimally sophisticated attacker, can bypass that protection. So there's, the blocking of the IP addresses may not be an effective way to do it. But I think to Larry's point earlier about the lack of funding for our elections, that's a symptom of it, right? We need to be able to have a nuanced approach that balances cybersecurity, but also makes sure that it's not unduly burdensome for voters to register and to vote. And so having the adequate resources that fund our election, this is really important in order to protect them. The only other thing that we heard of, the Florida voter registration database was down for a short period of time, like I think a couple of hours the night before the election. Again, this is probably a load issue. And some of these problems go directly back to having adequate resources to host and run elections, because we're using computers for all of this, and that requires investment if we want to maintain confidence in our elections.
I think you meant right before the registration deadline.
I forgot what I said. Sorry. Yeah, right before the registration deadline.
Recent.
Yeah, well, the only thing I would add to that is, elections are increasingly complicated, and particularly in this environment where there are great concerns around election system security. So, yes, we need more resources for election officials, experts, technical experts, security experts. But I also think election officials need to reach out to the experts that are available at places like the Department of Homeland Security and elsewhere for assistance, so that they're not, these are really complicated decisions, and it might have kind of make sense to somebody who's not an expert in the space, but who is running elections and has lots of other responsibilities, to not allow foreign IP addresses to register online. And that's just not a smart solution, but you might not realize that unless you were consulting with independent experts. I think on the flip side, we're seeing some, what I would say, and I think security experts would say, are bad decisions that try to strike this balance. Things like in West Virginia, where they're allowing military and overseas voters to vote on their phones. I think a lot of security experts have said, that is not of course, we want to make sure that military and overseas voters have easy access to the polls and can cast their ballots as easily as possible. But we don't want to take unnecessary security risks. And the conclusion of every independent expert that I've seen on this is that is too much of a risk with people's votes. And so striking that balance and understanding that balance, I think, necessarily requires consulting people who have the technical expertise to help with this, and approaching these issues with great humility.
Another question?
Yeah, Rob Pecoraro with Yahoo Finance. I'm wondering, the Secure Elections Act had bipartisan support and then went nowhere. How much does it hold back your efforts that this bill is not a law and is, I guess, going to sit around the hill until next year?
Well, I'd say it's discouraging that there was so much bipartisan support for action on this. And I believe at the last count there were 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. It may have been even more in the Senate for the bill. I believe that, at a minimum, we should have good, true post-election audit requirements, and we should ensure that any replacement of voting equipment comes with a paper backup. I think those are 2 very basic things. So it's all I could say is it's discouraging. I should make clear that if the Secure Elections Act passed this fall, it wouldn't have had an impact on this November's election. So I wouldn't say that the fact that it hasn't gotten through Congress yet is going to have any direct impact either on the 2018 election or potentially on the 2020 election. If Congress can get its act together and move something in early 2019, I think that'll still be plenty of time to make some of the critical changes that all of us have spoken about in time for the 2020 election.
And I just want to add to that. First, I do want to applaud, as Larry did, the sponsors of that legislation, because I think that they really understood that this is urgent, and it's not a partisan issue, it's a national security issue. And one of the things that meddling in our election was intended to do was to undermine confidence in our elections, and we need to bolster that confidence. And by having strong policy statement from Congress, that would help. But having said that, I do also want to point out, as Akene mentioned in her slides and Larry mentioned, things have changed since 2016. People are taking steps. The Department of Homeland Security is working much more closely with the states and the local institutions. Some of the stuff that was in the Secure Election Act is also happening at the same time. It's just not, it's just not law. So it would be better and more permanent to have Congress make a statement on that. And so, I agree with Larry that it's definitely not too late for Congress to act. But I think one thing that's really important is for people to understand that this is urgent, and what's urgent about it is that we have to be able to diffuse the narrative that undermines faith in our democracy, and that we know how to do that. We've been talking about those tools of how to do that, and the Secure Election Act would help in that regard.
Thanks. Next question.
I'm John Metcalf, CEO of Votech Corporation in San Diego, and been doing elections for 39 years, bringing technology to elections. So I've thought about what you're talking about today. I'm listening carefully, and we're with the EISAC and such to get the Department of Homeland Security alerts. We stress resiliency. We have to think about this all the time because our continued existence depends on doing the right things by our customers. So a lot of thought, and the resiliency is something we put even ahead of security because security is breached so often. So
do you have a question?
I would simply like to say, please be aware of Votech and my experience. If any of you would like to be in touch, I'll leave the forum for what you're doing here. But it's very important for me to contribute what I can. Thank you.
Thanks. Next questions, please.
Hi, this is Joe Marks from NextGov. I'm curious, the Homeland Security Department has spoken about having a online chat room on election day. They haven't provided many details. Do any of you know what that's going to look like? Have you been invited to it?
I don't know anything about it.
I haven't heard anything, but perhaps they are doing it through the sector coordinating councils. Maybe that it's through that they're setting up the chat room.
Yeah, thank you.
We have time for a few more questions.
This is Jim Camden in Washington State. I'm wondering if you think states that have all-mail balloting have special concerns, or do they have better security?
So this is Marion. They start out by having a voter marked paper ballot that's retained for recounts and audits. So that's a good thing. But it's not enough just to have the paper. You have to actually look at it and make sure that whatever counting mechanism you use counted correctly. So Washington took a step in that direction with legislation that had passed earlier this legislative session to implement more rigorous audits. So that's good, but I will also point out, and maybe Larry will chime in, or Kane, the one thing when we look at elections, we have to have a trustworthy record from end to end. So from the time that the ballot is delivered to the voter, to the marking of it, delivery of it, and then processing of it in election administration, that whole chain of processing needs to be trustworthy throughout. So that's in a vote by mail state. It's great that they have the paper records, but it's important to make sure that those steps, all of those steps, are done in a trustworthy way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'd say often when we talk about election security, there's like a focus on one thing, like the equipment or one step. And in the end, it's the entire process that really is what's going to ensure that you have security and that you're counting all the votes that you should be counting. And one of the things I think that's really important as states increase vote by mail, increasingly go towards vote by mail, is to ensure that the right procedures are in place to count every vote accurately. Washington and Oregon and Colorado have had a lot of experience with vote by mail over time and have developed pretty good procedures generally. But something that you do see in states with less exposure to vote by mail too often, I would say, is ballots get rejected and uncounted for technical reasons, sometimes huge numbers for things like voters, unclear instructions, and so voters not signing where they should or not providing all the information that they're supposed to on their ballot. So I do think it's really important as we make changes in elections that we're thinking about the whole system and all the processes before making big changes.
I would just chime in. I think for vote by mail states or areas where that's the technology being used, transparency is really important, and I would applaud those of you in Washington. I think all of the feedback we've gotten from activists in Washington State has been really positive about the work that you do to make sure that it's accessible and transparent and that people from both parties are involved. And I think that practice and developing it further is going to continue to inspire confidence. Another question?
Hi, yes, this is Jacqueline Thompson from The Hill. I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about voter suppression in terms of attacks on critical infrastructure. Are there concerns that an attack in that sense or a hack in that sense could keep voters away from the polls, and what's being done ahead of November's elections?
So, I mean, so there's only so there's good news and bad news in your question. The good news is that 70% of voters in the United States vote on equipment that has either a voter marked paper ballot or a paper record. So so as far as an attack on critical infrastructure, if you're talking about like the electrical grid, or I'm just trying to get clarification. Yes, we've seen this. It's like preparing for a natural disaster. So if those of you may remember in 2012, on the eastern seaboard, we had Superstorm Sandy. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, there were some polling places that couldn't open. They were flooded. And so there had to be a disaster recovery plan in place. And that's exactly what the kinds of steps that the Brennan Center is recommending. You have to take that into account when you're preparing for elections. Now, what is the risk? It's a risk management question. What is the risk that there will be an attack on our critical infrastructure, such as the electrical grid? That's hard to answer. But if there was no electricity in the polling place, able-bodied voters could mark a paper ballot. There would need to be accommodations made, I think, for voters with disabilities. But I think that's thinking about all of this in advance. And I think that's what has changed since 2016 is people are now thinking about these issues in advance and preparing to respond to something like that. It goes a long way to making sure that voting could continue uninterrupted. I'm sure Larry could add stuff to that.
The only thing I would add is that Marian's right. I think after the 2012 Hurricane Sandy, states started thinking about a lot more what their contingency plans were for natural disasters, and there's an overlap there with attacks on critical infrastructure. The other thing I would add is I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, and Kenya did as well to some extent, the Department of Homeland Security, the Belfer Center at Harvard, have been doing tabletop exercises with election officials where they go through some of these scenarios and force everyone to think about what are the steps that you take if you can't open up polling places, if you don't have electricity. And so there certainly is much more discussion and planning for this than there was even a few years ago.
Did that get to your question, Jacqueline? It was a little broken up for a minute.
Yeah.
So make sure.
Yeah, no. I was just wondering, what about in terms of making sure that voters feel confident in going to the polls if the electricity is down or something else along those lines? Do they think that maybe that's something that could just keep them at home rather than go, oh, I would rather just not vote at all?
I mean, look, that's always a concern. I think communication from election officials and others that work in the election space is going to be critical to encouraging people to get out and vote and to explain where and how they can vote. And again, if you look at the 2012 election, where there were pretty dramatic circumstances in New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania, they managed to, for the most part, get polling places up and running, and people were able to get to the polls.
Perfect example. The lights go out. I would say, from an activist perspective, as much as when these things happen, even what's happening in Florida right now, if there's both online and extended access to voting opportunities, it's really important, and you can't understate that. I know it creates logistical challenges, and sometimes there's challenges with limits on what you can do under law, but it's really, really important that folks have that opportunity to exercise that right. And I know that's been a dialogue over the last week. In Florida, certainly, it needs to be crystal clear to people what they can and cannot do, and it needs to be accessible online and by text and in ways that people who are dealing with disaster can access. Other questions? Last chance. All right, I'm going to close us out. I'm going to share contact information for each of the groups again. Thank you all so much for coming. Sorry, here, it's bigger. And please follow up with us if you have any other questions you weren't able to ask here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks for joining, and thank you, Akane, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Pleasure.